Okay, so like I said, luckily we have one mic that works, which we'll pass back and forth. But do let us know if we get if you have trouble hearing. But it wasn't just a trick to get you to move forward, but we're happy that you did, and we're really appreciative that you came out tonight. I know it's hard to get out on a cold weekday night, but we really appreciate you coming out here. I'm Natsu Saito. I teach at Georgia State's Law School, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us in this conversation with Tendayi Achiume and Mawuli Davis on how we can best utilize international human rights law and the mechanisms established by the UN to combat racism and xenophobia. Before we really get into the specific substance of it, I want to acknowledge that we're on Creek and Cherokee lands, and also lands that are soaked with the blood of enslaved Africans. I think it's really important for us to remember to literally be grounded where we are, and to remember and appreciate the history of our ancestors from this place and their role in this place. And in line with that, I wanted to ask Acknowledgements Umoja to pour some libations for us and help us to remember our ancestors.
So, y'all can hear me without the mic, right? Yep. All right. I've been known to have a big mouth. We want to ask all of you who are able to stand. And acknowledgement of our ancestors. First is the blue creator in heaven, and all of our ancestors who sit at the feet of the creator in lifetime, which is to come, Ashe. We salute all of our ancestors who were fortunate enough to be buried in the soil of Africa in a lifetime, which is to come, Ashe. We salute the spirits and the lives of the indigenous people who lived on this earth before the coming of the invaders, Ashe. We salute the names we did not know in a lifetime, which is to come, Ashe. O ancestors, blacker than the skies at midnight and brighter than the noonday sun, and all the beautiful shades of Africa in between. Great ancient priests, warriors, and mystic scientists. Field slaves, house slaves, domestic workers, professionals, freedom fighters. Give us the inspiration to fight 1,000 lions. Give us the enlightenment to unravel the mysteries of the universe. And give us the sustenance to travel through the trackless swamps of disharmony. We honor always your names. We ask you to join us on this day of education and deliberation. Ashe. We also want to acknowledge those of us who are not here. You know, some in old days when I learned about libation, it wasn't just for people who were deceased, but we would say the brothers who weren't here in the hood. So for our political prisoners and prisoners of war, we want to say Ashe. We want to say for the generations yet to come, Ashe. And honoring all the ancestors of everyone in this room, we say Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. You may be seated.
Thank you, Brother Acknowledgements. I'm so thrilled that we were able to do this event here tonight. And I wanted to thank the sponsors of this program, which include the Georgia State University College of Law, the Department of African American Studies, the Davis Bozeman Law Firm, and the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights. We have many amazing, wonderful freedom fighters and people who have struggled for human rights and civil rights in the audience today, and I can't acknowledge each of you because there's so many of you, but I'm really honored that so many of you are here tonight to have this conversation with us. I wanted to introduce very briefly, because both of our guests have, we could spend the whole night talking about their credentials, and we don't want to do that. But Tendayi Achiume, who's with us tonight, is a graduate of Yale Law School. She's the faculty director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA School of Law and a core faculty member of UCLA's Critical Race Studies program. She's also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. That's quite a title. And she's also the first woman to have served in that position, I believe. So we're really honored to have her with us. And in conversation with her, we have Mawuli Mel Davis, who I'm pretty sure all of you in this room know, because Mauli's the one we call whenever we have an issue. Most of us probably have him on speed dial, but our children do too, right? He's a founding partner of the Davis Bozeman Law Firm. We are very proud to call him an alum of Georgia State University's College of Law. He's acknowledged as a super lawyer, and he has, you know, your whole arm and legs length worth of various awards for community service and legal prowess. But what's more important, I think, for all of us is that he's known as our liberation lawyer for his work on civil rights and human rights work and police misconduct cases. So please welcome them both to this event. I'm going to mostly leave it up to Mawuli to ask some questions, and Tendayi, you're welcome to ask questions of us as well. I wanted to just start out by noting that, as some of you might remember, in 1964, Malcolm X said, "Whenever you're in a civil rights struggle, whether you know it or not, you're confining yourself to the jurisdiction of Uncle Sam." Civil rights keeps you in his pocket. Civil rights means you're asking Uncle Sam to treat you right. Human rights are something you were born with. And I think that that really, for me, captures the distinction that we're talking about here tonight, in the sense that we're trying to look beyond our struggles to get the government under whose claimed jurisdiction we live right now to do better by us and our communities, to say, you know, to make more demands of the state or the government or Congress or whoever, and to say there are, in fact, recognized rights that are inherent to human beings just by virtue of being human. And the fact that these rights reflect human dignity at their core. And that's what we're really sort of looking to, as a system that acknowledges those and trying to figure out how we can incorporate that system into our day-to-day struggles. There's a long, long tradition of utilizing international law and international human rights, starting with indigenous peoples from the very first encounters with Europeans. If you're interested in the African-American tradition of using international law, Henry Richardson has a wonderful volume on the history of that. So this is a tradition that goes way back. It's also a tradition that was utilized and invoked during what we often think of as a civil rights era, or by the movements for national liberation during the 60s and 70s. And so I think it's important for us to think about, that history, and to think about why we've sort of let it slip in a lot of ways, why we don't necessarily use it as frequently as we did, or invoke it, or teach ourselves or our kids about it the way we used to. And so the question is, why have we let that slip, and what can contemporary human rights law contribute to our struggles? And also, one of the things I'm hoping that we accomplish tonight is that it seems, when we talk about it, it seems so far away. The UN seems like something way out there somewhere. These treaties are, just words on paper. But in fact, it's a very human system that can be close to us, that we can use and invoke in our local struggles. And so I'd like to talk also about how we use human rights law in a very localized context. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mawuli. Would you like to get us started? Do you have any initial words you'd like to say, Tendayi?
So one thing is, you have to be careful with me. Once I start talking, it's almost impossible to get me to keep quiet. So I will just start with that and say you'll have to keep me in check. But I just wanted to begin by just saying a very profound thanks to a number of people. First, to all of you for being here on a Thursday night. It's a lot to ask, and I'm really appreciative for the audience and the very powerful audience that we have. And as I look into the audience, I can think of a number of people who I believe should be here in my place, actually, being on the other end of it, just because there are many, many amazing people in this audience, and I'm looking forward to learning from them. I also just want to say thanks to Natsu, who has been a mentor to me even before she knew me. I remember when I used to be in practice. I used to work as a human rights lawyer representing refugees and asylum seekers, and then made the transition to becoming an academic. And when I did, I was thinking a lot about the problem of xenophobia and trying to understand it within a human rights frame, and really struggled to find the work of people who were thinking about similar questions in powerful ways. And Natsu's work, I have to say, was the bright light that completely changed the way I was understanding the problems. And to this day, I think of her work as a touchstone, a place where I go to see things that I cannot see on my own. So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you all of you for coming. And thank you too for being willing to do this.
Oh man. So I'm completely overwhelmed by this experience, because being at Georgia State College of Law, there were a couple of safe spaces that were created. One of them was the African American Studies Department. Being a graduate research assistant for Baba AK was a safe space. Going over to Dr. Derby in the Office of African American Student Services and Programs was a safe space. But going to Natsu's office was a safe space. And for me to even be able to wrap my mind around human rights work was through her as well. So I'm very grateful to be here. I want to kind of lean in on the conversation and really want you to help ground us with some vocabulary, because I just find that because we have been so programmed to think purely along a civil rights track, we don't even have the language, and I'm reading, and you all already told her I have stalked her, okay? So I watched all of her YouTube videos, and we should look at them. Her reports, I have some reports in my bag. I wanted an autograph for me. It was a lot, right? But you're writing reports to the United Nations, and if you could help explain how that even happens, like what is a special rapporteur? How do you, what position do you take? Talk about the resolutions that that mandate your work. So I think if you could just kind of help center us around human rights, and then we can talk about how we can figure out the stuff that we're dealing with in these yet to be United States, how we can use human rights in our conversations and in our organizing work. So
absolutely, and stop me when I'm going too far. So I think this is a really good place to start. And in talking about the work that I do, I'll say a few words about the UN itself and say that even though I'm the UN Special Rapporteur, I don't work for the UN. So they appoint me, but I'm an independent expert. And so I speak to them, but I don't speak for them, which I think is actually ideal, because the UN itself is an entity with very big problems. So just to be clear that as the independent expert on racism, some of my criticisms can be about the UN as well, so I'll start with that. I think of a good way to think of the United Nations as the one body in the world where every nation state, and we can talk about what counts as a nation state, has a seat at the table, and it's a complicated space, it's a political space, but the UN is unique in that way. And they have a human rights machinery, or a part of the UN that is supposed to be sort of the global gatekeepers of how we understand human rights. And that's exciting in some ways, because it means you can have people from all over the world, or representatives of people from all over the world, in conversation about what human rights means at a global level, right? But it also has downsides, which is that, power and privilege mean that the strongest and loudest voices at the UN are often the ones that are not on the front lines of suffering, including racial subordination. And so I will say one of the frustrations I find in my job is that the people who have the most sophisticated language around what racial justice should look like are often not the ones who I'm interacting with at the UN. And so I'll come back to this idea of kind of the need to occupy the UN by people, including people who are in this room, who just have really powerful ways of understanding the problems and the solutions, and who could really contribute to, that system. So you have the UN system, and they have a human rights wing that appoints independent experts who report to different bodies within the UN on different issues. And my issues are contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, which is basically most of what is bad in this world. And when I got appointed, I didn't think it was going to happen. I was like, they're going to see what kind of thing I work on and be like, no ways, not her. It's worked out. But it has been overwhelming and intimidating, just because these issues all together, especially right now in the moment that we are, feel very heavy, and we can talk more about that. But to go back to what I do on a day-to-day basis, I would say there's probably 3 aspects of my job. One is country visits. So I will actually travel to countries and do fact-finding missions and produce a report on racial equality and the country's compliance with human rights standards. I need the permission of the country, so there is an outstanding request, for example, to the US, and there's been some advocacy to allow me to come and do an official visit here. That hasn't happened. But I visited the United Kingdom, Morocco, Qatar, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And so I do the country reports, and then I also do thematic reports. And the thematic reports, I get to pick the topic, and the idea is that those reports are supposed to touch on important issues that are relate to my mandate. And the idea is that I'm giving advice to UN member states on how they should address those issues. So you mentioned the reparations report, and I can talk at some point about why that report was really important. But for the audience, my last report to the General Assembly was actually on reparations for colonialism and slavery as an urgent contemporary issue for racial justice and racial equality. And so I've done one on that. I did one on extractivism. I'm going to do one on race and technology. And those reports are about forcing member states to really confront what racial justice and racial equality has to look like. And in that work, I try and bring, again, the perspective of the people who are experiencing racial subordination into how we understand human rights. I can talk more about that at a certain point. So there's the visits, there's the reports, and then I also do a lot of just engagement with different communities to make sense of their struggles and how I might be able to leverage the battles they're trying to fight within the UN system. So I have a communication system where people can make allegations of human rights violations, and I can then communicate with member states to say, we've received this allegation, what are you doing about it? Eventually those communications are made public, and they can be used in advocacy contexts as well. So that's as quick as possible. I can give an overview, but I'm happy to dive deeper into any of those aspects.
You talk in your reparations, and I'm sorry, Jamoke, I had to just jump right in. Brother Jamoke is a long time reparations, their sister Jewel, Baba AK, so many reparations advocates. I have to just go there for 1 second, and then we can pivot. But in your report, you talk about the importance of the Durban Declaration. I was able to be a part of to go to South Africa for the United Nations World Conference Against Racism. So that was a incredible moment. I think I may have been in my last year of law school, but can you explain kind of what the Durban Declaration is and the framework that it helped set around reparations internationally? And if you would even, how can we use the Durban, I mean, in reading your report, I hadn't even thought of it in years, and I'm ashamed to say that. I had not thought of it. How can we use it now in this moment as reparations is becoming a lot more of a buzzword even in U.S. politics?
And let's start with what does Durban Declaration mean?
Okay. Great. And I actually, when I was coming in, I saw what is reparations in the classroom over there, and I almost ran in to be like, can I sit in the back and learn? Yeah. So the Durban Declaration it's the Durban Declaration is an agreement that UN member states made in Durban, South Africa, at the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. And, you know, I'm not surprised to hear you say that you haven't thought about Durban or the Durban Declaration in a really long time. One of the things that I find fascinating has been the disappearing of the Durban Declaration and of what was achieved at Durban within the UN system. And I'll come back to why I think that disappearing act has been, and by disappearing I mean somebody is disappearing it, not that it itself, you know. But so at Durban, at this World Conference Against Racism, which was held in 2001, you know, South Africa had, you know, become independent, wasn't under apartheid. My understanding was that it was a very exciting moment. I was not there, and I'm really sad that I wasn't. It occurred about 2 weeks before September 11, you know, and the proximity of September 11 to that conference, I think, also helped overshadow many of the achievements that were made there and generate a momentum around securitization that then undercut the gains at Durban. But the Durban Declaration, to me, is the most powerful agreement that we have in the UN system, and for helping us understand how we should be thinking about racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia and related intolerance. And that document is the product of so much civil society advocacy globally that it's a very powerful, and I think for that reason considered a dangerous document, because I think it speaks to the reality of how we should be making sense of racial discrimination. So the Durban Declaration insists that history is vital for understanding the present, and the history of slavery and colonialism, which it said should be understood as, you know, crimes against humanity, right? Understanding that those harms are central to understanding contemporary dynamics, and that you cannot separate the two, so that historic injustices and continuing subordination have to be seen as a pair, and you can't fix one without fixing the other. The Durban Declaration, I view, as also a document that is bringing together different groups who have to understand their struggles as intertwined. And Natsu, your work here, I think, is really powerful. You know, it talks about people of African descent, people of Asian descent, indigenous people, different people who have come under colonial subordination in different parts of the world and in different ways, and the document basically says these struggles are intertwined, including migrants and refugees, you know. So it is a very powerful document, and I see it as laying out a structural and historical account of how we should understand so much of the struggle that we see, and that colonialism and slavery can never be set aside as unrelated to what's going on. And it has a program of action. It has things that it calls on states to do, which if they actually did, I think would be really powerful. So this is the 20th anniversary, or the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration is coming up in 2021, I suppose. I was just doing some quick addition here. And I think it will be exciting to see whether there can be momentum that unlocks that instrument in different parts of the world.
A quick follow-up too. So when we talk about, I think one of the things that those of us who advocated around reparations in the United States is the connection to global advocacy around reparations, primarily for people of African descent, but for all folks. One of the things that I thought you raised in your report is demystifying the idea of reparations. Like, for all of us, we think as reparations is like heaven, it's some pie in the sky. Like, you know, we'll never get that. It's just something you wish for, and then maybe it'll happen someday. But the emphasis on demystifying it as, you know, this isn't something that black folks just came up with that popped into our heads. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then we can move off of reparations for a minute? All right, don't get upset with me, Jamoke, but.
So working on that report was really educational for me. So my background is as a public international lawyer, and in doing research for this report, one of the things that was stunning to me is to kind of confront or reconfront that reparations is a standard remedy in international law. It's in international law documents. You have provision for reparations when there are violations of certain, when there's certain kinds of violations. And so that's one thing. It's there in the law. Number two, it's happened and continues to happen. There's many groups that are granted reparations depending on the type of violation. And I think it comes back to something that you were talking about, which is imagination, right? And when we think about change and social change and moving forward, sometimes the biggest barrier is the ways that our minds have been shrunk to, or kind of prevented from seeing or imagining exactly what can be. And with reparations, I think they somehow successfully, it's been made to seem kind of aberrational, or how dare you ask for that? Well, that's completely impossible. And so one of the things that I do in the report is try to document instances where reparations have been granted and to point out that a common feature of how reparations are granted is actually that they're granted on a racially discriminatory basis. So the very structures that produce the harms that result in calls for reparations are then also inflecting how reparations are given. And I'll give you some examples. People who know US history will know that reparations for slavery were given to former slave owners in this country. That happened. In the UK, similarly, former slave owning families in the UK were granted reparations. And the UK example is actually terrifying because the amount of money that was set aside for reparations by the British government was so massive that they needed to take out government bonds to be able to pay the families who are formerly enslaved families. And there was an economist who tweeted a few years ago that actually British taxpayers were paying off reparations to formerly enslaved families until 2015. 2015 is when the financial instruments that allowed for those reparations to get paid off, that's when it ended. And if you think about the UK right now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Windrush scandal, which involved, an aggressive immigration enforcement program by the UK government, but that resulted in the deportation of Afro-Caribbeans who were living in the UK and who were citizens of the UK and who had actually been brought there under colonial rule as labor, who were now, in 2017 being deported to including people who weren't even born in the Caribbean. But some of those people who were deported, if you do the maths, were probably paying back reparations to formerly enslaved families because of the timing, right? So what was mind-blowing for me is just, you're right. It's a remedy that is available in law and that is regularly used, and that where reparations for colonialism and slavery have happened, they've happened on a racially discriminatory basis. And so part of the problem is that we haven't untethered ourselves from the structures that produce the problem in the first place. Yeah.
You talked about the immigration issues and some of the things that I've had a chance to read and hear you talk about, the idea of what is being called a crisis in America around protect the borders. Can you talk a little bit about the role, because I think most people just, and these are so-called conscious folks, right, just see people marching to the borders and they don't get the context of the U.S.'s role in creating situations and systems that people have to flee from, right? It's like the U.S. is creating a situation. When people are responding to it, then the U.S. is saying, oh, no, you can't come, but you're the reason that I need to, leave my country because of what you've done. So could you talk a little bit about that and provide some context, because that right now obviously is as the United States goes into this 2020 presidential election, it's an issue. So if you could just talk a little bit about that and how that's happening around the world, that is not just a U.S. phenomena.
Can I say that Tendayi has recently published a wonderful article called Migration as Decolonization, and is currently working on one called Racial Borders. And so she's done really amazing theoretical work on these. If any of you are interested in following up and getting those, I'm happy to try to make them available.
So thinking about borders and getting me to talk about borders is very dangerous, again, because it's like, exactly, it's really kind of where I'm living. And it's been interesting to be in the role of special rapporteur while thinking about borders, and to realize that, not to realize, but to see how border enforcement everywhere in the world is a racial project. This is what I'm seeing, and part of racial borders, that's what Natsu's talking about, is my attempt to kind of try and theorize what that looks like, because it's just what I'm seeing, you know. So I will do visits in countries where, as you approach the border, and I can talk about this because it's in the report that I wrote, but if you are in Morocco, a country that has actually done a fair amount of pushing back against the EU's intervention, but if you're in that country, as you drive north, right, as you approach Europe, Black Africans, right, there's fewer and fewer of them in public spaces, and it's not by accident. It's because the racial profiling of Black Africans in the north of Morocco is so intensive. So as you're approaching, you know, Europe, certain bodies, you know, can't even come close, right? And so you see that there. I've seen it basically in every single country I've been to in the world, and I think you see it at the US border as well. When there is a lot of talk about unauthorized migrants, right, I often say to my students, when you think of the unauthorized migrant, you're thinking about a non-white individual. There's just no question about it, right? And we think of unauthorized migrants as raised in a particular way, as coming from particular places. But for people who study migration, they know that unauthorized migration, or people who are in the country in an unauthorized way, most of them are coming in with documentation that lapses. So it's not the person who comes at the border without the papers. It's people who come in on visas, and then those visas expire, and we can talk about what the racial profile, the racial profile of those people might be. And in working on this project, it's actually been really difficult to find materials on white unauthorized migration. Not because it doesn't happen, but because borders are so racialized that even the study, it seems to me, of white unauthorized migration it doesn't appear unless in this country, for example, if you go back to maybe Irish people and Jews prior to them becoming white, right? So that, I think, is a very important thing to think about, you know. And I know just anecdotally in my own work that I, you know, will speak to white people who describe their experiences of being unauthorized in the country that they're in. So we know it's happening. But anyway, so like I said, I can go on so many different tangents, but let me try and come back to your question, which is about how we should think about the border. So I think, and this is something that I've been working on in my work, we take borders for granted as fine, and the issue is who's moving, who's coming, who's going, and how many of them are there, where are they coming from, what rights do they have. But it's important to think of the work that borders do themselves in preserving inequality and sustaining privileges of different kinds, really intense ones, you know, if you really think about it. And right now with the US, the southern border, I think that's a very important place where we can ask some of these questions. So if you think about Central Americans who are trying to reach the US, and if you ask, what are these people fleeing? What are they trying to get away from, right? Some of them are fleeing conflict. Some of them are fleeing severe economic hardship. People are fleeing for all kinds of reasons. And some people are choosing to move in ways that are not as coerced as other actors, right? So as with all migrations, people are moving for different reasons. But so much of the conditions in Central America that are resulting in displacement are intimately connected to the United States and to its projection of power in that part of the world in lots of different ways, right? So US corporate intervention in Central America and just the shifting of economies there to operate according to logics that then mean that profit can be made from them by US corporations. That's a very big part of shifting economies there. So I was reading a report that was talking about how people in Honduras who during difficult economic times were able to use subsistence farming methods to be able to stay are unable to do so because lands have been bought up by big foreign corporations that are now producing bananas or whatever it is that are then exported and consumed in the very countries that then say, you can't come here, who are you, right? If you think about military intervention in Central America, you know, it's massive. In Migration as Decolonization, I write this, I focus on Africans who are trying to get to Europe. And you think about Europe's intervention into Africa and how those people who are coming are not strangers. You know, these are the family members that you have called over because of the way that you have intervened in the parts of the world that they are coming from. So to me, I think remembering or paying attention to the racial nature of borders and paying attention to how global interconnection, which I think has a lot to do with global capitalism, right, which benefits countries such as the US. So if you're an American, if you have a US passport, your privilege is in some ways unspeakable, right? And if you have a US passport and you're black, and if you have a US passport and you're white, obviously the levels of your privilege are also kind of different, right? But there is something about having that passport at all that means that you are implicated in what is happening in other parts of the world, or I think should be a basis for solidarity, actually, and saying we may be facing common problems here, right? So if you're in the US and you're marginalized in the US, understanding the people at the US southern border as allies and trying to really think about what it means to unravel US empire, to me, I think that's where the solutions lie, is seeing borders for what they are, as preserving privilege and injustice in ways that we don't interrogate enough.
Thank you. And I think one of the challenges is that we don't see U.S. as U.S. empire, right? And so we have black people that are upset and saying, "Oh, they're coming to take my job." We don't see the empire, imperialism, some of the language that we're even using right now. It's just not common language to really put the correct framework around our experience. So I think that's one of the challenges. I know folks want to ask questions. I do want to pivot. We do a lot of work around criminal justice reform. And so, I guess our perspective is that we have all of these killings by police of black people. We have over-incarceration. We also have, when brothers and sisters are incarcerated, they end up dead in these jails. We have a case I'd love to share with you on Shali Tilson, a young brother who was arrested for a misdemeanor, and 9 days later he's dead of dehydration. So we have those things that are happening and they're ongoing, and we're not getting any, and it's frustrating for us as a civil rights firm. It's hard to win. That's one of the hardest areas to practice in. My good friend Brian Spears, we have all kinds of cases that we work on together, and the way U.S. 1983 constitutional law is constructed, it's a hurdle. It's crazy. I don't have an academic word for it other than crazy. But how can we, and families get frustrated, right? Because you keep saying, well, they're saying, how the hell did they kill my son? My son was unarmed. And then you're saying that there's immunity for the officers that did that. Where is the justice? Is there any path for those families to bring forward human rights claims, violations? What, if you could, is there a path forward that we could share? Because as organizers, it's frustrating. You can only do so many marches, so many rallies, and we got so many hashtags, and these are lives, but people are frustrated, and we frustrated with the U.S. government's and the criminal justice system as it relates to the killing of black folks. So, any thoughts? I know that was kind of a big question. Sorry.
And I have to say, I've been really inspired in hearing from Natsu about the work that you've been doing right here in Atlanta, and look forward to thinking about ways that we might collaborate. But so with the U.S. criminal justice system, even before being in the role of rapporteur, I have to say that it's, to me, the most soul-crushing work is thinking about the US criminal justice system and doing prison work. There's just something about that universe, that feels deliberate. It's deliberately designed to dehumanize and destroy people, unlike other kinds of things that I think about in human rights. When I'm thinking about, genocide or wars, there's a kind of exceptional nature to what's happening and everybody agrees. But with the criminal justice system, it is, and that's the plan. And there's so much defense of it, including, exactly, it's normalized. And in the rapporteurship, what is stunning to me is going to parts of the world that the US considers its peers and having people just be like, what is going on with the prison system there? Like visiting a prison in the Netherlands versus visiting a prison. It's night and day. So something truly terrifying and unacceptable happens in this country and doesn't happen in others. And I think it's because, and I'm not the first to say or think this, the criminal justice system here to me feels like a form of racial governance, right? Settler colonial form of racial governance, and must be understood in those terms, and I think must be addressed in those terms, right? So really undoing the criminal justice is about undoing that particular form of racial governance in a kind of settler colonial history, and then also thinking about the present as implicated in that. So I can say more about that, but I think it's important to mark that. When I think about what the human rights frame can do to advance the fight against the criminal justice system in this country, I think it goes back to the imagination questions again. When I was in law school, the word abolition was like the word reparations. It's like, oh, the unicorns and the fairies and the what. Now I wake up and I think, of course it's abolition, and that is an urgent project for today, not like for somewhere in the future. But the big problem, I think, one of the big barriers with abolition is just imagination. What do we imagine in its place? And I find even when I'm with my students, the ones who are most interested in social justice, the question of what abolition might look like completely stumps them. And I think it's not an accident. We're training them not to reimagine. We're training them to move papers around within the, racial governance system that I've described as a settler colonial one, right? So I see the human rights as offering a language or a way of seeing each other that can allow us to think of different ways, aka abolition. And I'll talk about a project that we've been doing in LA, and this I was doing before I was in the rapporteurship. I teach a human rights clinic at UCLA Law School, and Los Angeles has adopted an international treaty. So there's a treaty that's called the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I realize I've been facing you, but I should have been facing you guys, sorry. But so this treaty is supposed to be about eliminating discrimination against women. The US has refused to ratify this treaty. You can ask why. But Los Angeles as a city adopted the treaty as an ordinance, and the city made a commitment that we want to see those human rights obligations implemented in the city. And cities could do this with any convention. So the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, really powerful treaty. You might imagine Atlanta adopting that treaty as a city ordinance. But anyway, so LA adopted CEDAW.
Decatur, too.
Decatur, right, yeah? And so LA has adopted the CEDAW ordinance, and the project that we have had, we're done with the first phase, had UCLA law students who are studying international human rights partnering with a group of incarcerated women at the California Institute for Women, which is a maximum security prison facility in LA. And the goal of our collaboration was to try and reimagine what the rights of women who are re-entering Los Angeles communities after they're incarcerated, what rights are they owed to employment and housing if we bring a human rights framework to bear on this. Because the civil rights framework or the civil law framework just offered nothing. And the most powerful thing that came out of that collaboration was using the language of human rights to speak directly to the lived experiences of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women in a way that meant the women themselves, were articulating not just the problems that they had experienced, but the solutions to them, right? So they were producing knowledge on what the policy should look like, using the kind of language that framed them as human beings who were worthy of rights and of dignity, irrespective of citizenship status, irrespective of statute X, Y, and Z. And it was a very powerful experience. So in the space of criminal justice work, I see some of the magic that can come from human rights is just allowing for different kinds of conversations to be had about really difficult topics.
Yeah.
So we're going to be moving to questions from the audience, so I hope you all will be thinking about those, and we'll ask, will somebody check and see if that mic is working? If it's not working, there may not be a point. Okay. Yeah, we'll have to get you to raise your hands or whatever and yell out. Before we go there, though, I just wanted to go ask you one more question, which was earlier we were talking about sort of the mutual benefits that can come from seeing our struggles as part of international struggles. And I was wondering if you could just say a word or two about sort of the complementary nature of working, bringing in international law to our struggles.
So I really think that there's a potential for a synergistic relationship. One of the things that has been heartbreaking to me is, being in the human rights system and realizing that within that system, race has itself been marginalized, right? So I thought that being special rapporteur, I would be like solving sophisticated racial problems, and it's just, most of my work is basic stuff, which is trying to convince people that racism exists, which is soul crushing, as you all know. But so within the human rights system, I think that there is potential for a much more powerful use of the existing instruments that we have. So this international convention that I mentioned, which the US has ratified, has so much in there that is powerful. It has provisions for affirmative action, for example, as something that is required by international human rights law. But it's not necessarily being activated within the UN system in the way that it could, because groups in the US that I think have the most sophisticated or very sophisticated racial justice critiques are separate from the UN system, or at least there's a gap there, right? But then on the other side, I think that the international system allows for people who are involved in local and national struggles to bring international attention to exactly who and what the US is, right? And to hold it accountable on an international stage. Because if you're in the UN system, if you're outside of the US has a very kind of powerful discourse about itself as, the bastion of justice and the leader for freedom, right? And I think the best way to kind of reveal the real story is for people who live in the US to be at the UN exposing what's going on, because I think it creates another lever for change on the ground. And so you were talking about the criminal justice system. Justin Hansford, who is at Howard, who worked with Mike Brown's family after his shooting to take his case to the Inter-American system. So I'm talking about the UN, but there is a system within the Americas, a human rights system that the US is a part of. And they filed a petition at the Inter-American system, and they also went to the UN. And part of that was about, really exposing what's happening, but then also creating potential for building solidarity with people in other parts of the world who are also living under kind of racial governance through criminal justice systems. And so you had been the one who asked me. I thought it was you. I was turning in the other way. But so I think that there's a two-way thing going on here. One, I think people who are here have so much to share with people who are outside. And then I think the world outside can very much help put pressure on the government to, do what it says it's doing when it goes abroad. And, you started off with a quote from Malcolm X. And I think it speaks to the fact that historically there was a period when the racial justice movement in the US understood itself as very intimately tied to the anti-colonial movement, and it was a transnational struggle. And I think there's people in this room who could speak in a more, powerful way to that, and we can think about when that ended and how, and it wasn't by accident. There were active steps taken to dismantle the transnational nature of, anti-racism movements. And I think the fact that governments could invest in dismantling these movements speaks to the potential that there is when you're all seeing the same forces in different parts of the world and can come together and call them out. So I think there's a two-way street, and I hope that there will be movement there. Will you?
Okay, I think.
100 more questions.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I love that we came back around to that point, because for those of us who are old enough to remember the 60s and 70s, or for those of y'all who have read about it, it's not an accident that all that energy and those movements, those national liberation movements here in the U.S. came out of a recognition of this global movement for decolonization. And there were independent struggles, wars for independence, right, happening all over the planet. And we took inspiration we modeled our movements on them. We understood that these were efforts for self-determination, not just for civil rights. And, like Tendayi said, it's not an accident that those have been severed, and that now we've been taught to think inside of very narrow boxes. And I think that by opening ourselves up to this international framework, it's not just that we can go and ask the UN for something, instead of Congress. It's that we open ourselves up to a whole different way of understanding what it means to be human, what it means to have rights with respect to each other and responsibilities with respect to each other and the earth, and what it means for us to be self-determining peoples, that we don't have to be bound by what we are told we have to do or we have to be. So thank you, and let's see, I'm sorry these... The lights are a little bright, and we can't turn them down, apparently. So in order to see people, I'm sorry, this looks really weird, but let's see. Okay, we have a question down here. Shout it out, and then we'll go. Okay, then we'll go to the brother right on the side, okay?
Okay, we hear about the United Nations, and who or what constitute the United Nations? Because I'm not sure if I know what countries are involved or who are involved. So when we say we take to the United Nations, who do we take or flight to?
So there's a number of different places that it might go, and the first question, who is the United Nations? I forget this number, but if there's about 204 countries in the world, I could be maybe 230 countries, I'd say about almost 200 are there. So just about every state has a seat at the table at the United Nations. So it does mean that it becomes a forum that's available to just about everybody, and I think that's important. Within the UN, there's different kinds of bodies that individuals and groups can access directly. So one way to go would be to try and lobby your government to do things once it gets to the UN. But in terms of UN mechanisms, there's a number. So I'll focus on the ones that relate to racial discrimination. There is a treaty body, which basically means a kind of a quasi-judicial body that is responsible for overseeing this international convention for the elimination of racial discrimination. And that treaty body, the U.S. is bound by it because the U.S. has ratified that treaty. And actually, Gay McDougall, some of you may know, who's an amazing American racial justice advocate, sat on that body and has been phenomenal in it. And they take individual petitions or group petitions. If there's been violations of, if you've experienced racial discrimination, you can make petitions to this body, and it can issue a decision, vis-a-vis the United States. Of course, there is no UN army that comes in to enforce the decision once it's been handed down, but it becomes yet another mechanism for advocacy. So there's that body. There's a group that's called the Working Group on Experts of People of African Descent. And they can take complaints and issues that are directly dealing with peoples of African descent all over the world. And so that's another body that would be available to receive complaints. And I can try and email some of this information to Natsu so that you have it. So, so the treaty body, there's the working group. My mandate, similarly, I can take communications as well, and I can share information about how you can access them. But there are a number of different avenues that allow for individuals, without even getting the consent from their states, to go directly to make a claim at that level.
And when you say go to the United Nations, Are we saying
Oh, well, so you send it via email. You send the communications via email. But there are sometimes there are events that have in-person kind of gatherings of either in Geneva or in New York. So the headquarters of the UN is in New York, and a lot happens at the General Assembly there. But then the human rights heart is in Geneva, and so a lot of the human rights mechanisms will meet there. I think we have a question over here.
As the professor brought up earlier, Malcolm X, one of Malcolm X's objectives was to bring the U.S. before the UN for a human rights violation. My question would be, is the U.S. appropriate, is it the proper body now, given the fact that, is the UN the proper body to bring the U.S. upon human rights violation, given the fact that the U.S. is still, given the Security Council position, is still in control of the UN and its enforcement? Is it still able to be that body of justice that people that are being abused in America can use to take these trials, these violations?
So that's a question that I think a lot about, and I think it's a really deep question. And one of the things I ask myself, so what is the UN? And I've answered what is the UN in a number of different ways. But if you think about the history of the United Nations, its origins are complicit in the colonial project as well, right? So where it is coming out of so many of the things that we're saying we're trying to remedy now. And so it is, to my mind, going to be inherently limited by its genealogy. It's a body that is made up of nation states, right? And some are more powerful than others, obviously, and you see that in the dynamics of the politics of the UN and how things are enforced. And so there's a way in which there are no clean tools, it is to my mind, and this is why I made clear that I don't work for the UN, I speak to them, and I think this is probably stressful for them that I get on the stage and I'm like, and this is why. But there are very, very, very big problems with that institution, and also very big race problems with that institution. You can get me started about that. So I don't think that it is any more or any less good a place to go, I think that it, along with most multilateral, if not all, have these same power dynamics that play themselves out. But I think it's a place that ground shouldn't be ceded, right? And I think that change doesn't happen ever because good people said, oh, now we're going to be good. It happens in the most unexpected ways. And so I see the UN as a platform that could be mobilized as part of a larger struggle to bring about change. And so it's one piece, it's an imperfect piece, but there are sometimes opportunities where you can shift for some incremental change. I mean, I've now gotten to the point where it's like I really think the nation state is like part of the problem, right? But I'm in the UN system, and if you don't believe in the nation state and you're the special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, there's like serious tensions there. But I do think wanting to see a completely new world shouldn't be in tension with not ceding possible tools that we might use in the here and now.
Joe?
So I think your comment really speaks to the harm that is done, again, by siloing and keeping people separate from each other, because you're right to point out just how much deep thinking and mobilizing there has been in the US around reparations, and so there's a lot of knowledge that has been produced and could be mobilized, and I think it would be exciting to have people who are here in conversation with people in other parts of the world who are thinking about reparations, and I know that there are spaces where that's happening. In terms of whether or not there's a body that exists right now that could do... Right, but how would it mean to get there?
My question is it possible to create something
Yeah.
that through the United
Mm-hmm.
Nations that would have oversight if there's space in
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
laws and rules?
Yeah. So...
Other people got represented.
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways. There's lots of different ways that it's happened, and I after this I will give you a way to access the report, because that's one of the things I try and do in there. So we are in the decade of people of African descent, which is a UN decade that has been established with resources that have been set aside, and I know that in that context there are different groups that are trying to think about exactly what you're describing, which is what would it mean to design and establish some kind of mechanism that would do that. And how successful those conversations are going to be is yet to be discovered. But I know that in my work, one of the things I'm trying to do is kind of help build momentum around some of those. And in the report, one thing I ask for is exactly what you're describing, some kind of global institution that had the expertise to really facilitate reparations in the here and now. What would that look like? So the short answer is, I think the framework of the decade, to my mind, is the one that is the most promising right now, where I've seen momentum around pushing for exactly what you're talking about. At the same time, the reparations debate within the UN, I mean, I thought I was going to have rotten tomatoes thrown at me at the GA when I presented the report, because it's one of those things that has been made so difficult to talk about, And so it's this tension where I think there is movement energy, but among member states, especially the ones that are most complicit, a resistance to even say the word colonialism or even to say the word race. So it's this difficult thing where there's some momentum and then a kind of amnesia and aphasia that blows my mind every time I encounter it.
I just want to ask, what about with the NGO structure rather than the UN?
Yeah, so within the
I mean, that non-governmental.
Mm-hmm. Within the decade of peoples of African descent, the groups that have been the most active are actually NGOs and movement actors. And so I can put you in touch with some of the groups that I've been on some emailing lists where they've been having conversations about exactly how to try and actualize mechanisms around reparations. And they are NGO driven, which I think is not surprising.
Hey, hello. My name is Larry. I'm with ADOS, American Slavery, here in Atlanta. We are a newer group that's fighting for reparations, but we're going at the American government. One of the most controversial and unique things about our group is that we don't believe reparations should go to every black person in the United States, only those who descend from slavery here in America. And some people find that controversial, even xenophobic. So, for example, you're from Southern Africa, right? If you were to move here to the United States, say tomorrow, do you think you should get reparations from the United States government, or maybe you had a child that was born here, and the father is from another part of the world? Do that child that was born here, should they get reparations from the United States? So,
Is that your question, brother?
no, yeah, but
Okay.
yeah, okay.
Can she answer it?
So, what are your thoughts on that? Who should receive that? Should it be every black person in the United States, or should it be those who descended from slavery in America?
Thank you, brother.
Yeah, so when I think about reparations and when I talk about reparations in the report that I produced, it's rooted in colonialism and slavery, which I understand to be global projects, to have been global projects. And one of the things that I'm insisting on in the report is to think about these structures as global and to think about them as not just about the past, but about the present as well, right? So reparations isn't just about historic injustice, it's very much about that, and there have to be reparations for historic injustice, but there also has to be reparations for ongoing harms, and reparations which includes undoing structures that basically reflect the logics of colonialism and racial discrimination. The struggle for reparations within the US, the national conversation around it, I think has lots of different voices that are calling for lots of different things that depend on how you define the harm, right? And I think that debate is an important debate that needs to be had. But in my own work, I see the harm as a global harm. I see it as one that shaped relations in much of the world. The international order, I think, is just steeped in the relations that are established in the projects of colonialism and slavery. So when I think about moving forward towards actually achieving reparations, my own first step is about thinking about forming allegiances with the different groups who are subordinated under those structures, and then figuring out what it means to make sure that all who are impacted, receive those reparations, whatever they might look like. So I'm coming from a global perspective, honestly, because that's how I've been thinking about those challenges, and that's the view that I would take.
Genocide. This was the lawyer from the 1940s who had ties with Russia, who took this document, We Charge Genocide, to the United Nations in 1952. And not a whole lot of benefit came out of that. And so my question about enforcement is, given the United States doesn't seem to respect any country that doesn't have nukes, should we try to rebuild those relationships with Russia that we had in the 30s, and now also build those relationships with China, so that we can get perhaps some enforcement, even if it gets some policy written in our favor?
I mean, I guess I'll say I don't know is the first thing that I'll say. But I do want to say something about enforcement, right? Which I think is something that people often think about when they're thinking about the UN. And I'm coming from a legal background, right? So enforcement, the power of law, these are all things that we talk a lot about. I think when I think about what racial justice will look like and what will take us there, right now I'm obsessed with how we even describe the problems. And that seems to me to be where there's battles there that have been fought before we even get to enforcement, right? And so I think you're pointing at something that's really, really important. How do we think about how once you have the laws or once you have the principles, how do we get them to be enforced on the ground? But the thing I want to spotlight is that if what we're trying to do is change the world that we are living in, change is a chaotic process and one that can occur even when you don't have quote unquote enforcement, if that's the case, if you can think of it that way. I grew up in Southern Africa, and I remember very vividly the end of apartheid. And end of apartheid is a controversial thing, I think, to say, because if you go to South Africa right now, there are structures of subordination that exist. But that moment was still an important one. 1994 was still important, even if we still need to do more, which I think we do. It was a really important one. And I often think about what forces led to what happened there, and whether if you were alive, and many people here were actually involved in the struggle, so I really want to claim my naivety and kind of innocence and all of this stuff. But I bring that example up because I think if you look at the examples of when there have been changes that have been marked as meaningful changes, what the world looked like in that time is a lot like this, right? And so I say all of that to say, yes, the US is a superpower, a hegemon that exerts force in the UN in ways that mean that you're not going to be able to go there and magically solve all of the problems. But it's to say that has been the case for a very long time, and still it has been possible to make the kinds of gains that shift people's experiences in the day-to-day. And I think that's important as well. So To your first question, I don't know, but some thoughts on enforcement.
I think we should look at, when we look at Russia and we look at China, look at the current relationship we have with, Russia was involved in helping suppress black voting here, that, that we were the target. So I don't know how, we can be in relationship with them like that. And then when we just came back from Ghana, I think what you'll see is throughout the continent that China is gobbling up everything. And so I don't necessarily see either of them, even though they have nukes, as being that, pro-African. I think they all are exploiters of African people and resources. And so I think we got to guard against that. And I think our power just ultimately is going to rely amongst us connecting around the globe. So, so for whatever that's worth. And just by the way, we charge genocide. I know you said nothing happened from it, but we charge genocide, William Patterson. Folks built off of that, IMBUF, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, other organizations have built off of that. So even when we feel like the work was for naught, here's another generation, that's in the 40s, then another generation of organizers picked it up, just like you have it, and said, let's organize around We Charge Genocide, and we have been doing that. So appreciate you. Queen Mother Moore was a part. And the other piece I just wanted to share around this whole, how we got to this place around not turning this into a civil rights. Carol Anderson, who's a professor over at Emory, wrote this piece called Eyes Off the Prize, where she talks about the NAACP pivoting, really kind of coming under some assault when they were initially raising our issues as human rights issues, and the U.S. forces were like, nah, let's keep this is civil rights. And so so that book helps frame part of the pivot from civil rights. But the everyday working black folk in the 60s and 70s, they rejected that, and we still embrace human rights. So I think there's been a cycle of efforts to stop us from connecting on a human rights level, because civil rights pigeonholes us and it doesn't bring it forward. So, Paul.
Thank you for coming and for this program. I have a question. There's been a movement in southern states to remove monuments to white supremacy that were put up sometimes more than 100 years ago after the Civil War. And our city, the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights, led a march of students and community members. The city passed a resolution to remove this particular monument. The county did the same. Then the state of Georgia intervened and said that no community could remove these things, denying our community's right to self-determination. We've had some discussion with NATSU, but I'm wondering if there is some international framework that we could maybe think about in terms of our being denied the right to decide what to do with these things, and how we can proceed, because we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, maybe we could exchange contact details, because I actually think there's a few people who might be good to speak to about exactly this, if that's okay.
We have time for one more question, or two if we're really quick. We have 5 minutes.
You have a brother here and a brother here.
And maybe we can take both of them, and then I can
Okay,
respond
let's do
to
those
that.
two. Yeah, how about you
You
both
and then-
ask your questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
My question is just for clarity. You had said that there was a possibility of a local municipality being able to bring an ordinance to bear on the issues that may be happening in law enforcement. Is that something that the human rights law would allow Atlanta, Decatur, or one of our other cities to bring at the forefront, so that we can begin to hold these officers or hold the municipalities responsible for what is going on? Is there something like that in place?
She'll answer them
She's
both.
gonna ask them both.
Oh, okay, yeah, so I believe we can pat our head and rub our stomach at the same time. So what I mean by that is we can have the concept that we're all one people or international people, and this is an international global fight. But ADOS, we're using the political system as leverage to fight for reparations in this country. I think what we all have to be careful of is throwing the word xenophobic around. I think that's kind of intellectually lazy. We've been accused of being xenophobic. But when you have CARICOM in the Caribbean that's fighting for reparations specifically for the Caribbean, how is it xenophobic when we are pushing for the same thing? So I think we can all support each other. So what are your views on CARICOM specifically fighting for reparations for the Caribbean? And how is that xenophobic that we're specifically making a distinction that yes, we are part of the black global family, but we have, because we just admitted that the UN doesn't have any team, and they have issues, and it's not easy to get any type of repair from them. So how do you read that?
It's safe for CARICOM is for everybody.
Yeah. So I have to be honest and say that using the word xenophobia, I've hardly used it up here, but I can talk a fair amount about xenophobia, which I think is a really complex and under-theorized, but very important concept in law and in other spaces. To speak to CARICOM's work, so CARICOM is a multilateral body of Caribbean states that have been doing a lot of work in different areas, but also have been pushing for reparations for Caribbean nations. And they have a 10-point plan for reparations, which I think is one of the most sophisticated multilateral plans for bringing reparations to the Caribbean. And in my report, I actually cite CARICOM and say that they're doing important work in that space. I think the fight for reparations has to be multi-strategic. I think really there has to be a multi-strategic approach. And, I'm aware that there are complicated debates taking place within the U.S. about how reparations are accorded. And from your question, I'm also getting a sense that you're coming with the weight of a bigger debate that you've been involved in. And I would say that in my work and in the report that I've produced, my focus is on finding common ground, and that's sort of where my energy is going, and that's the thing that I've been paying the most attention to. So I don't see CARICOM's project as mutually exclusive with other projects for pursuing reparations, and I think that multi-strategic approach is important. And then on the ordinances, so there's two layers. I don't know enough about municipal law in Georgia to know, but whether or not a city can adopt an ordinance, I think I think there are a few barriers to human rights treaties being adopted as ordinances. I think what's harder is some of the laws that you were pointing at, the federal laws that immunize some of the actors who are engaged in some of the biggest brutalities. And those can't be overcome, I don't think, with the ordinances, at least not directly. The question is, can the ordinances shift what we understand to be injustice in ways that might result in changing the federal laws? That might sound like crazy talk, but maybe that's the first step, that we have the kind of federal laws that we have, that protect actors who are engaging in racial violence, to me is stunning. And it could be that part of undoing those is changing the way we talk about that, again, starting from city ordinances that create different kinds of conversations about the violations that are taking place. But I do know that federal law is, kind of emerges as a barrier in some way.
Okay, we have just about run out of time. I just want to say in wrapping this up that I think it's really important to remember we've come to, I think, some better understanding of some of the international mechanisms and options and laws without having the chance to really get into a lot of the substance of them, but to recognizing that there is a body of law out there that recognizes international human rights and that is founded on the dignity of human beings. And I just would like to encourage us to use our imagination, as Tendayi said, to allow this to open us up to think more broadly, not to go, it's good to think about the enforcement question, right? But I don't think it's helpful to say, well, Uncle Sam can't help us with civil rights, so the UN, let's just find another master to go to ask for help from. That's not the point of this stuff, right? For me, the point is that this body of law, which is always changing and evolving, reflects certain understandings about basic human dignity and human rights and the right to self-determination. It gives us space. We invoke it to affirm what we already know about ourselves and our rights, and to create space in which we can create change that does not depend on somebody else protecting us or enforcing it for us. And to me, that's the beauty and the potential of this law. So can we all say thank you to our guests for coming in?
Just a quick announcement. We intend on continuing this dialogue in different ways. We recorded this, so we'll try to make it available on our website. And we also, I think, you know how there are these street law projects where we go teach young people. If we can develop some human rights law for organizers so that we can increase our vocabulary and help incorporate it into the work that we're doing, we'll put that up as well and try to share it out. But so davisbozeman.com, right, Asada? I think Asada's here. So we'll put it up in the next, hopefully 72 hours, we'll have something up. All right.